I am Rock Lee, and you're listening to the Zane Man.
Oh, yes, Danhausen here, Danhausen. Listen to the Zane Man, or be cursed.
Tonight, I am Batman, and you're listening to the Zan Man.
Well, Mr. Zandman.
Well. The prodigal son promised us last week that he would be better about his upload schedule, and here he is, late again. Poor planning, whatever your excuses, we don't want to hear it. That's right, ladies and gents, welcome to Zandom Thoughts, the podcast where it takes mere moments to break a promise. But no, I feel like I have a good excuse this time, but it really is just an excuse. I have kids. That's not the only excuse, I promise. It was literally recording day, and I was going to upload the podcast by July 4th. And the whole idea, literally decided that day. What am I going to do for 4th of July? I know, I'll just write an entire story surrounding all of the presidents being dropped on an island and fighting it out until there's only one. That'll be really doable. It wasn't doable. I literally gave myself a single day to do it. And I got a couple of pages in. Lo and behold, here we are today, and I've recorded the the entirety of my story. It ended up being 28 pages in a Google Doc, and I don't even remember how long the recording is, but it's at least an hour. So that definitely was not doable. I didn't make it realistic for myself, especially if I want it to be a good quality podcast. So I think this one was worth waiting for, but ultimately that's up to you. You'll have to let me know. Give this podcast a review. It doesn't even need 5 stars. I just want to hear what you guys think of this episode because I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed the process of writing, and maybe in the future, if you guys enjoy me writing stories like this, I can write stuff that's even better, but plan it out a little bit better to where it doesn't have to be waited for. I can upload an episode here, an episode there, and before you know it, I've had 2 or 3 weeks to write a story, and that's the next episode of the podcast. I've been listening to a podcast actually called The Creepcast, which is where Papa Meat, if you've ever gone on YouTube and seen Meat Canyon, he's the one that usually makes animations, and it's Toy Story, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog, it's Ed, Edd n Eddy, that's one of his more well-known ones, and they're heavily distorted, almost to a disturbing level. A lot of people would describe his animation style as disgusting, but there's a beauty to it, and that's how he became popular. Well, him and a YouTuber known as Wendigoon go on and they talk about creepypastas. I'll eventually talk about Mothman and stuff here on the podcast, but it's creepy stuff like that. And they literally will read the story, which should take about 50 minutes, and it ends up being a 3-4 hour podcast. And that's what I listen to while I'm at work. Well, they have a subreddit, and I kind of want to write a story that I'm going to submit to them there, based on one of my experiences from a previous job. So if you guys would want to hear more stuff about me writing stories, I don't know. I've already said it way too many times, but let me know. I would really like some feedback on how I did this episode. It's probably a little redundant at times, even going back and editing now. It does feel a bit redundant at times, but I think I did a decent enough job. But I've already kept you guys waiting long enough. Without further ado, here it is, the Presidential Battle Royale. Wait no longer. So before I officially start reading off this story I've written for you guys, I have to declare to you, this Battle Royale is not meant to be taken seriously. And I'm probably already saying that way too much in this episode, but I can't emphasize that enough. It is just for fun. Realistically, if we were going to do this battle royale, there's 2 or 3 people that you could easily pick, and the rest kind of just jockey for position. But I didn't want it to be that simple, and I really just wanted to focus on the story elements more than anything. And so keep that in mind as we go into the story. And also, there's a couple of clarifications and rules that I want to set. Unlike a traditional battle royale type setting, every president in this match is preset on the island ahead of their match. They're away from other contestants. They arrive on the island with a few tools at their disposal, but those tools are typically something to match that we know about them. For example, if Abraham Lincoln likes log cabins, he might have an axe, something like that. 2, none of them are familiar with this terrain. They've never been here before. They aren't given any navigation equipment. And 3, there are 3 ways to be eliminated. If you are killed, incapacitated, which means you're unable to continue, so if you get your leg blown off and you can't move or anything like that, you're probably out. Or if you verbally give up. This will be confirmed with a voiceover that plays on the island speakers. And those are the 3 clarifications I wanted to get out of the way before we dive into the story. And without further ado, let's dive into the story. The air is initially silent on this Independence Day morning. A slight breeze fills the air on the hidden presidential aisle. However, it is a silence that is only destined for a short life, living in an environment that was part of a bigger plan. That plan goes live today. Jet engines rip through the morning air like fireworks that were sure to celebrate freedom later in the evening. Call them Air Force 1, 2, 3. It doesn't matter as long as it's understood that these are the carriages for the United States presidents of the present and the past. Each of them going through their routines, and some even more spooked by the modern machinery. Picture a spooked George Washington trying to comprehend a jet, if you will. But all of them with one idea repeating in their heads: there can only be one. Before long, jets start landing and the presidents begin to ready themselves. According to the rules, upon landing, the presidents have 20 minutes to conclude preparations before the Royale begins. The events will then start, which is signaled by all of the jets taking off. The presidents go through their routine, seemingly more for the calming of nerves over the prospect of being ready for battle. Glancing over a few of our contestants, we can see the routines are a wide range. For instance, we see Teddy Roosevelt cleaning and preparing his guns that he brought along. William Taft is taking his usual pre-battle bath. Come to think of it, dude takes a bath before pretty much any scenario. Donald Trump is formulating posts for his social media to light the masses ablaze. George Washington is getting his mind blown by conversations about modern advances on false teeth. Yes, a wide array of preparations go forth in preparation for this momentous event. Time dissolves quickly like water being poured over sugar. For some, this is a blessing as they're chomping at the bit to get started, and for others, nerves and anticipation are building quickly. But as the saying goes, ready or not, here it comes. For time waits for no man. A countdown blares over the speakers, sending the presidents into a readied state of mind. The countdown itself feels like the longest part of the waiting, as each second counting down from 30 seems to float in a void slowly, never to be found again. Before long, the number 1 is reached and the jets take off, revealing that the battle has indeed commenced. Upon the departure of the jets, about 20 seconds rush by and an announcement tears across the island. The 27th President of the United States, William Taft, has been eliminated. Shock shoots across the face of every president under a shock wave. But how? How so soon? Turns out, with modern ingenuity, most bathtubs have been upgraded to fit one-size-fits-all scenarios. The baths on these Air Force style of jets, however, have chosen to uphold a more classic feel. William Taft was stuck in the bathtub and learned this a little too late. He was unable to exit the plane upon liftoff, and due to not being able to compete, he was considered incapacitated and therefore eliminated. I'll take a break for a second. William Taft was never going to win this. He was over 300 pounds. He was unathletic. He didn't have a ton of war experience. And he's literally known for being the president that got stuck in the presidential bathtub. So this seemed like a fitting end for him. So that's my justification for it. Back to the story. Let me clarify from this point forward, the story will no longer be narrated from an overall omnipotent point of view, but by an elimination scenario to elimination scenario type basis. This is to ensure the cleanest possible point of storytelling for all. A good first point of view prospect is the first president of the United States himself, George Washington. George spent the first 20 minutes or so of his time frame exploring the surrounding area. As a master of terrain and someone who helped map out much of the early America during his explorations, this is surely an advantage that he would have over the competition. He scanned the land and spotted various potential hiding spots, vantage points, and if necessary, retreat camps. His concentration was broken a few times by the speakers announcing various eliminations. President number 4, James Madison, has been eliminated. President number 14, Franklin Pierce, has been eliminated. President number 8, Martin Van Buren, has been eliminated. The calm voice over the intercom blasted through time and time again, with so many contestants being eliminated in such quick succession, it could unwind the nerves of even the bravest of men. But not George Washington, no. Having fought for the very freedom the country they all served from the day they declared independence, this was a feeling he had grown accustomed to. If anything, it fed the fire that stirred up inside of him and burned him to push forward in a mighty way. I'll take another break to explain that James Madison, Franklin Pierce, and Martin Van Buren, none of them had really any combat experience, and I actually just looked up, for that reason, all of these presidents, just to figure out some of the people I can eliminate early, because writing a story like this, with how many presidents there are, it would take a while to eliminate as much as I would like, even though I find a clever way to do it, I think, later on in the story. This is pretty much just trimming the fat a bit, and there will be quite a bit of eliminations in the background as we lead up towards the climax, primarily because there are presidents that when you look at them, they are just politicians. They don't have war experience. In a survival battle royale type setting, there's no way they're going to win. Granted, there are some like this that we kind of push and make notable characters, but none of these people I felt matched that criteria, which is why I eliminated them. This should explain quite a few people who are going to be getting eliminated, and unless otherwise, I will tell you guys when that comes. Back to the story. Washington spied an overpass ahead, almost like a natural bridge forming between two hills. He decided that this was his next destination, and he could use it to get a better vantage point. A peaceful venture it would prove not to be, however, as a large interrupted the peaceful crunch of the grass beneath his feet. It was a gunshot, and the bullet hit about a yard in front of him. Immediately, Washington scattered behind a thick trunk of a nearby tree. Washington already knew where the bullet came from. He just had to confirm it. He peeked out to look at the overpass, and immediately a bullet tore into the bark of the tree that acted as a shield for him. "Give it up, Washington," echoed a familiar voice. It was a voice he'd known anywhere. John Adams. "Nobody has to die," he continued. "There's 2 of us up here and just 1 of you." 2? Who's with him? Though the more George thought about it, the more it began to make sense. Each president had to bring their own gear on the island. John would likely have flintlock-powered weapons in his possession, so there's no way he would be able to get 2 shots off in such quick succession as he had done. "You know I'm too stubborn for that nonsense, John," called George back, "though I admire that tenacity." "Don't be foolish, George. You're smart enough to know when you're at a major disadvantage." George couldn't help but let out a smile at the threat of his friend. That's where John was wrong. When it comes to warfare, combat, and surveillance, George had John beat in pretty much every category. The X factor was, who exactly was with John? There really is only one way to find out. Luckily for George, he had glanced the terrain before approaching the overpass. There was a flank that he could take advantage of by going up the left hill. Since they likely hadn't completed reloading yet, George took his chance and ran through the lightly wooded area. John was likely the first shot due to how inaccurate it was. He would probably be the first one done reloading, which gave George a chance of making it. Whomever John was with appeared to be a much better shot. "Let's hope his partner has a flintlock gun too," thought George as he ducked from tree to tree. It wasn't too much later that George arrived at the base of the left side of the hill. George had heard one more gunshot during his sprint to the hill, and it hadn't sounded like it hit anywhere near him. They just might think he's still behind the oaked shield, but there's no way to know for sure. George just knew, though, that it was a risk he was going to have to take. He took a deep breath and ascended the hill. It was much shorter and easier to climb than he initially had thought from a distance. It took him only a moment, but he was able to reach the top. He crouched down and slowly hunkered towards the bridged overpass. An initial glance saw that just one figure seemed to be looking out over the gorge he had come from. George aimed his flintlock rifle at the figure and pushed forward. The figure seemed to notice George out of his peripherals and turned towards him. The moment he did, he was met with lead as George squeezed the trigger. The figure was John, and George hit him straight in the shoulder, which caused him to drop his own rifle. George pushed inward cautiously, but it was only when he approached John that he noticed the figure take off towards the direction he had just come from. "Tried to flank me, John, and got flanked for your troubles." "You always were aggressive in your approach, George," said John, grimacing in pain. "Andrew went down to flank you. It made sense since he's a better shot than I am." "Jackson?" asked George. "Aye." "I'm sorry, John." Don't be. It's part of the game. As you saw, we were prepared to do the exact same. But now it appears over." "Yeah, I suppose you're right," said John. "I surrender," he said out loud. Almost with an immediate reaction, the speakers blare out the announcement. "The second president of the United States, John Adams, has been eliminated." George helped John up to his feet. "You shouldn't let your guard down. You know Andrew's a crafty one." "I know, but with how fast he sprinted out of here, I don't think I'll have to cross his path for a little while longer," smiled George. "Besides, my friend needs me." "A friend you shot," sneered John. "Aye," snickered George. He helped John to a near metal pod with a door. These metal pods were all over the island so that combatants who surrendered were ensured a safe departure. John opened the door and entered, but turned to face George. "Be careful, Washington. Not all of your enemies will be as easy as me, nor as friendly. If you offer them the same mercy you showed me, you might not make it out of this competition alive. And I'll be ready to deal the kill shot when that time comes," George stated with a smile but intensity radiating from his eyes. "It's something that I may have to do with that madman Andrew." Taking a break from the story, John Adams was never going to win. He does have battle experience, but it was mainly going to be a story building purpose for a president that, was also in his time frame. Unpause. This is where we are going to shift the point of view. We are instead transported over to Andrew Jackson, who is sprinting away from the overpass towards the shorelines of the island. Fear isn't an accurate description of what motivated his actions to run away. "Instincts," Andrew said aloud to himself as though there were others to hear his justifications. Andrew had been in enough duels, brawls, and wars to know that retreat is sometimes necessary. It's not about fear or being a coward, it's about self-preservation. "And I'm a master at that," Andrew said out loud once again. He seemed to be far away enough now, where he wouldn't have to worry about gunshots. Realistically, he was out of range from the obsolete weaponry a while ago, but hearing his temporary partner get eliminated made him want to be that much more certain. He spied a small shack a little off the beaches by the coastline and decided to make his way towards it. He took maybe another step and then heard gunfire nearby. It wasn't being fired at him, at least he didn't think so, but it appeared that there was another brawl occurring on the beach. It probably wasn't the smartest idea, but in the interest of preservation, "Cut the numbers, survive longer," Andrew said out loud with a smile crossing his face. He was upon the scene in less than a minute. As Andrew arrived on the beach, there was a man crouched behind a beached large boat, seemingly the one who fired the shot. His back was facing Andrew. Another gunshot rang out from the other side and struck the boat on its broadside. The shot seemed to come from a couple of large rocks a little bit further down the beach. Andrew took a knee to observe a bit further. He couldn't see the man behind the rocks, but observed the man behind the boat. He was a big man, built like an ox. Although he wielded a flintlock rifle, he reloaded it with extreme speed and precision. It felt like just a matter of seconds before the man was perched and ready for his next shot. Andrew inched forward, careful not to make too much noise. Although unideal for traversal, the sand suppressed his footsteps. As he got closer, he could tell who it was. Civil War participant Major William McKinley. A true specimen of hand-to-hand combat based purely on his brute strength that he could exude on foes. Andrew salivated at the idea of dueling him. Andrew continued to descend upon him, but the emergen was snapped when William fired his shot. Knowing he would squat back down and half turn to reload once more, there was a good chance Andrew would be spotted in the peripherals. Before anything had a chance to transpire, the speaker blared once more. "President number 30, Colin Coolidge, has been eliminated." This appeared to take William's attention, so Andrew took advantage. He broke out in a sprint, pulling at the dagger from his belt. Before William's sense could catch up and spot Andrew, the blade was being plunged into his neck already. With quick precision, Andrew pulled it out and immediately plunged it back into William, this time in his gut. Blood sputtered out of the open wound on McKinley's neck, and it was only a matter of time now. William fell to his knees as Andrew freed the blade from its freshly prison once more. Andrew calmly grabbed the rifle that had fallen from William's grasp and tossed it away. "Fresh blood smells like pennies," said Andrew. He methodically rounded to William's back and sliced through the belt loop. He had held it up, which revealed a hidden pistol and blade of William's very own. Andrew smiled before tossing it from an unreachable distance from the quickly fading president. William collapsed forward onto his stomach, attempting to speak, but managing only to make gurgling noises as the blood filled his throat. Andrew turned his attention towards the rocks on the other side of the beach. One down, one more to go. Andrew looked out from behind the boat just in time to see a figure duck back behind the rock. This caused Andrew to immediately go on the offensive. He pulled out his own rifle from his back, aimed, and began marching forward, daring the figure to peek his head out once more. "President number 25, William McKinley, has been eliminated," blared the speakers. The announcement caused the figure to peek up at the speaker from behind the rock, exposing his head ever so slightly. Andrew immediately fired, but was slightly off. The old school bullet sparked as it struck the rock, and immediately the figure ducked back behind the rock. Andrew's march turned into a run, and in one fluid motion, tucked the rifle back into the holster on his back while removing the dagger once more from his belt. Before the figure could peek back out again, Andrew had already flanked the other side of the rock and kicked the man, knocking him off balance. The man fell onto his stomach as the rifle in his hands launched forward. He rolled onto his back, revealing to be James Buchanan. "Pity," Andrew said out loud, knowing full well James's fighting prowess was below average in this competition. Andrew was slightly disappointed as he contemplated dueling this man with a blaze of honor. Andrew pulled his pistol from his belt and aimed it right at James. "Wait!" James started. But that was all he managed to speak before Andrew pulled the trigger. As the sound of the pistol blasted through the island, we are transported to the other side of that very island, into an intense gunfight between two sides. So this is, the shifting of the point of view. And the point of view we are going into is Theodore Roosevelt. Also, the James Buchanan elimination. Originally, I was going to have him eliminated off screen, but I figured it would be good to utilize him to show that we are going in the crazy direction for Andrew Jackson. If you don't know, Andrew Jackson is one of the few presidents who challenged someone to a duel and actually killed them. And there was an assassination attempt on his life that failed. Like, they went up to him, pulled the trigger on the gun malfunctioned or something like that, and he beat the guy almost to death with the cane he had in his hand. So he's got a little bit of a screw loose, and we're definitely using that to our advantage in this story. Anyway, back to Teddy. Teddy found himself in a tough spot. He knew coming into this that everyone had a big red circle around his name while prepping for this thing, as he had been selected by the experts, fans, and even amongst his fellow competitors as the favorite to win this whole thing. So it only made sense that his competition would band together in order to eliminate him. Teddy was in the lowlands behind a massive rock, but in front of him were a hill on either side. To paint the picture, if you looked at the scenery from above, it looked like the rocks from each position were creating a directional arrow. The only difference is his competition had the high ground and he was down below. On his left, Barack Obama had him pinned down with modern weaponry. The modernness of the weapon making up for the lack of experience with that weapon. Directly in front of him, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Not the weakest link by any means, but physically the least imposing of the trio. On the right, Warren G. Harding. Teddy didn't feel overwhelmed, however. As far as he was concerned, this was a fair fight. It was him and his trusty pal Winchester that he gripped tightly in his hands. Not the most modernized tool, but still deadly accurate, especially in his hands. Teddy made up in his mind that he would attempt to pick off Barack first. With his modern gun, he posed the biggest threat and trusted the other two to miss their shots a bit more. He took a breath, rose up, aimed, and heard a gunshot directly from behind him. It took a moment to register before he dropped down behind cover. A fire burned into his back, right above his right shoulder blade. He had been shot. He looked up to see a fourth man that he had not accounted for, Gerald Ford. "I got him! Come on over," called out Gerald. "Well played," chuckled Teddy. "Very tactical. Very impressive." He spoke through slightly exasperated breaths. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," said Gerald matter-of-factly, "but none of us dared take you on one-on-one." "I get it. No apology needed," said Teddy. Before long, the other three had caught up with Gerald. "I saw you rise up from behind that rock looking in my direction. Felt death tickle the back of my neck for a split second," smiled Barack Obama. "Thank goodness Gerald here stepped in when he did." "I'm just sorry that you didn't make it a bit further," said Franklin Roosevelt. "It almost seems like a shame that the Chuck Norris of the presidents didn't win this whole thing. Any one of us has the ability to win, and the only thing we have to fear was Teddy Roosevelt himself." Teddy smiled at this, but was quickly brought back to a plain face at Warren Harding's comment. "We'll just need your surrender then, and we can be on our way." "I'm afraid that won't be happening." His response caused the four men to look at each other in a knowing disappointment. "You know what we'll have to do then?" questioned Gerald. "I do, and I'm prepared for it," said Teddy. Barack handed a Beretta from his belt to Gerald, who accepted the gun and held it at his side before turning to Teddy and said, "Any last words then?" "Yes," said Teddy plainly. "A call of respect to the nature of this island, to the competition, and to the four of you who bested me." He cupped both hands together and then proceeded to blare out some sort of nature animal call. The four men looked at each other confused. Gerald attempted to speak again, but had his words stolen from him at the sight of three grizzly bears emerging seemingly out of nowhere, one of them immediately clobbering Warren Harding to the ground. Gerald Ford raised his Beretta to shoot in retaliation, pulling the trigger multiple times. He might as well have been throwing pennies at these beasts as they ran through his bullets and overtook him. FDR's body was too crippled to run, but fired defense shots of his own. Barack Obama kept his wits, utilized his athletics in an attempt to run away. One of the grizzlies unfortunately noticed, and the world was reminded just how fast a grizzly bear could be. Nobody surrendered. Nobody had time to. Instead, the four men who were on top of the world a moment ago were now shredded on the ground. After the work was completed, the bears seemed to instinctively walk to Teddy. "Thank you, my friends. I thought that was the end." The bears seemed to grunt in acknowledgement, and then proceeded to disappear as quickly as they had arrived. Our cameras panned to a remote spot a few miles towards the other side of the island, where we settle on Donald Trump, who is exploring the innards of an abandoned cottage. He is inspecting it thoroughly, seeming to be deciding about whether this would be an appropriate base of operations or not in this long siege of a competition. He shook his head no after a few more minutes and decided to exit out the back. Upon exiting, he noticed a manhole cover near the underline of the couple of trees. He walked over to it and gave a cover a tap with his foot. Hollow. He pondered the idea of giving it a lift to discover what was underneath, but felt something tickle his ear. It sounded like breathing, almost like someone was sniffing in his right ear. He turned around to find Joe Biden, who was now pointing a gun in his direction. "Hello, Donald," Joe said, smiling. The speaker near the cottage burst out, seeming to catch up with the battle we just saw with Teddy Roosevelt. "The 44th president, Barack Obama, has been eliminated." Joe looked up expectantly, sorrowfully, hearing the name of his old companion. The speaker rang out again. "The 29th president, Warren G. Harding, has been eliminated." "You think they're still living, Sleepy?" I can't do Donald Trump's impression, man. "You think they're still living, Sleepy Joe?" asked Donald. The speaker called out a third time. "The 38th president, Gerald Ford, has been eliminated." "Must have been a huge spectacle with this many announcements," he continued, receiving no answer for his question. The speaker echoed one final time. "The 32nd president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, has been eliminated." There was a silence between Donald and Joe. Once he was sure he wouldn't be interrupted, Joe finally answered Donald's question. "It doesn't matter." He started with a plain look on his face. "What matters is what happens to you. And you may not realize it, but in spite of our differences, I don't want to kill you, Donald." He stopped for a minute as though he had to think really hard about his next words. "But if you don't want to die," he continued to say, "you'll have to say it." Donald kept a plain look on his face as well and took a minute to answer. "Say what?" Donald questioned. Joe smiled and said, "I surrender, of course," with a subtle nod to force home those words. They paused for a second, allowing the wind to whistle for a moment. The speaker suddenly squealed the life overhead and spoke. The 46th president, Joe Biden, has been eliminated. Donald smiled at this. His plan had worked. Joe had a confused yet impressed expression on his face. He didn't say anything. He just wagged his finger towards Donald in a silent display of respect. They stood there for a long time, Donald standing still, seeming to wait to hear from Joe, and Joe just standing there with his mouth agape, still wearing that confused smile and staring at the sky. Donald's smile disappeared from his face. "Joe?" Donald asked. "Sleepy Joe?" He repeated again about 10 seconds later. He waved a hand in front of Joe's face, and when it was clear nobody was home, he began walking away. He would walk a few steps, turn back. Joe didn't move. Walked a few more steps, turned around. Joe never moved. He turned back every few steps, and still, Joe never moved. Donald decided he was just going to leave, and he turned around one last time to spy a worker coming from the metal bunkers to collect a Joe Biden who was still frozen in time. I thought an interaction between Joe Biden and Donald was necessary, and I initially was going to have them do a boxing match that they had talked about in real life. But instead, I figured it would just be a funny way to trick Joe Biden, use his senile nature against him. Originally, I was gonna. There's a clip out there that Joe Biden, like, he feels betrayed by the Democratic Party now, and so there's a clip of him pulling a MAGA hat out of his pocket and putting it on. I was going to utilize that as part of the story, but that seemed like a little bit too much. I figured him just zoning out and having to be carried off by workers was an appropriate end. And I have other plans for Donald, which you will, if you are listening to this whole podcast and you are planning to do so, you'll find out soon. But let's continue forward, shall we? We're still in his point of view. Donald continued inland away from the cottage. He got about a mile away before hearing a commotion from an upcoming clearing. It sounded like shouting. By proceeding forward, he noticed 3 figures standing in a circle, seemingly screaming at each other. He pulled out some binoculars out of his breast pocket and glanced through them. The 3 men were gigantic specimens. Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Grover Cleveland. It was clear they were ready to throw down. Almost as if on cue, Ulysses threw a huge punch towards Grover, which sent him stumbling back. Rutherford grabbed him from behind and threw him to the ground. This ended up sending off a chain of events, almost like a dance, where all 3 of them took turns either throwing each other or punching each other in the face, with no one really getting too much of an advantage. It's almost as though the 3 men agreed to fight a clean fight beforehand, which is why they formed a circle prior. This almost seemed to be confirmed when Grover Cleveland retrieved a knife from his coat pocket on the ground and went after Rutherford with it. This was met with a double team from both Hayes and Grant, much to the dismay of Grover Cleveland. Still, Grover was resilient and held on to his knife. In spite of being hit with huge shots from both men, he hung on to his knife and even managed to dig a sizable slice into the arm of Rutherford Hayes. Ulysses Grant managed to tackle him to the ground with a football-style tackle, finally knocking the knife free from his grasp. He rained down giant lion-esque paws right into the facial structure of Grover. "You have no honor!" screamed Ulysses. Grover rolled onto his hands and knees and attempted to crawl away. Rutherford pushed past Ulysses, seeing nothing but red. He grabbed Grover by the neck and twisted with all of his might. Although far away, Donald could hear that crack from his position. A neck snap. The speaker squealed alive in response to this. The 22nd and 24th President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, has been eliminated. This announcement sparked a curious look in Donald's eye. The brawl continued after Rutherford and Ulysses exchanged a few words and then shook hands. They traded punch after punch until finally Ulysses unleashed one that knocked Rutherford to the ground. In Donald's opinion, it was a pretty stupid plan of attack, as the recovery plan following the brawl didn't exactly encourage longevity in this battle royale. He couldn't hear what they were saying as they exchanged words once more. Ulysses delivered one final punch to Rutherford on the ground, which seemed to knock him out. A few moments later, the speaker came to life once more. The 19th President, Rutherford B. Hayes, has been eliminated. Ulysses collapsed onto his back with blood dripping slightly from his mouth and nose. The exchange had clearly taken it out of him, but he appeared to be satisfied with the results. Donald noticed a couple of figures approaching from the other direction. Ulysses didn't seem to notice this. Donald pushed forward silently. The pack of vultures known as Benjamin Harrison and John Tyler came to clean up the scraps as they approached Ulysses with their guns already drawn. Though Grant preferred honorable encounters, the reality of war is that it isn't always an honorable affair. Benjamin circled around to the front of Ulysses, who now began to sit up, seemingly realizing what's going on. John Tyler stayed to his backside with his rifle aimed straight at him. "Dang, Ulysses," Benjamin began. "By the looks of things, there should have been 2 eliminations just now." He smirked as Ulysses glared at him unimpressed. "But perhaps that's just a mistake on the part of the judging community," he continued. "Perhaps we should correct that now." Ulysses didn't answer. "What do you think, John?" called out Benjamin. "I'm usually against violence," started John Tyler, "but it doesn't seem like he understands the gravity of the situation. Perhaps we should just wipe him from the board now and not give him a chance to react." The speaker squealed to life again. "The 39th president, Jimmy Carter, has been eliminated." All 3 men looked in the direction of the speakers while the announcement rang out. Still, looking in the direction of the speaker, Benjamin spoke out. "Well, I suppose we will just have to..." But that's all he got out before a gunshot pop rung out. Blood shot out of the side of Benjamin's head in response. Everyone's attention shot to the direction the shot came from, to reveal Donald Trump holding a Beretta. John Tyler panicked a bit and began to swing his rifle in his direction, and in an immediate response, Ulysses picked himself up and swarmed him, tackling him to the ground. He rained down a couple of hammer-fisted punches, snatched John's rifle from him, and smashed the butt of the rifle into John's temple, knocking him out, and possibly more. "The 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison, has been eliminated," shouted the speaker in response. And then, "The 10th President of the United States, John Tyler, has been eliminated." Ulysses sat back down on the ground, catching his breath with a huff. He nodded in an approving and thankful manner towards Donald. Donald stepped forward with the gun lowered and stashed it back to wherever he pulled it out from. "So, Ulysses," he started, "have you noticed there are manholes all over the island?" Ulysses perked up with curiosity. Donald's next words are enshrouded in mystery as we are pulled away from the scene and quickly paced to another spot on the island. The view becomes significantly more lumbered up, shall we say, as we find ourselves in a heavily forested area on the island. The camera stops on a very familiar top hat as we pan down to see the face of Honest Abe, one Mr. Abraham Lincoln. In opposition to the presidents we followed so far, Abraham finds himself getting the jump on someone. For once. Well, I guess Andrew Jackson did the same, but, well, he sees him first, but Abraham is an honest man and instead chooses to approach his enemy. It's Zachary Taylor. "Hello, good sir," Abraham begins as he pulls his pistol from his trousers. Zachary turns around, revealing his jacket to be tattered from a previous battle. "You ought to be more careful," Abraham said. "There's a couple of men on this isle that would have shot you and not thought twice about it." "Smart men," Zachary responded. "It is war, after all." "True, but what kind of men would we be if we lost ourselves in the essence of the events we find ourselves in?" Zachary scoffed. "If it's on the grounds of protecting everything you fought for, I'd argue that makes you a pretty good man." "Well, we can agree to disagree," said Abe as he walked towards Zachary, who backed away in response. "But I'd rather be the man who loses face to face than win by shooting someone in the back." "You wouldn't have won," said Zachary, with his scowl turning into a smirk. "I knew you were coming, but if you want to lose face to face, have it your way." As soon as he finished the sentence, he pulled out a long blade from his belt and sliced a rope that Abe had failed to see on one of the trees. A log attached to another rope proceeded to swing past Zachary and straight towards Abe. Abe dove out of the way, but was immediately ambushed by Zachary as he pulled himself back to his feet. Zachary plunged the knife towards Abraham, but Abraham managed to pull his left hand in the way. The knife stuck straight through. Abraham screamed in pain, but threw a right hook towards Zachary, who backed out of the way. He seemed to reach for something at his belt, which Abe responded to by charging him and taking him down with a double leg. "Those wrestling roots coming in clutch, son." A pistol flew from Zachary's hand as he fell to the ground. Zachary's breath was knocked from him, but he still managed to flail a bit and catch Abe with an elbow to the face. Abraham grimaced, but didn't let the pain stop him from utilizing his wrestling experience to advance position. Fighting and flailing as he tried, eventually the larger man, Abraham, had tied Zachary into a pretzel. Abraham huffed, seeming to hold Zachary down effortlessly in spite of his tired demeanor. "Zachary, I have to ask you to surrender." Zachary responded by spitting in Abe's face. Abe, in spite of his principles, retaliated with a stiff punch to the right side of Zachary's face. Zachary spat again, this time not at Abraham, but strictly for the sake of getting blood out of his mouth. You're asking me to take part in an action that stands against everything America was built on, Zachary said. If we had given up, we'd all be British right now. Do what you have to do, but I'm not a quitter, Abe. Just like I hope you wouldn't be. Abe seemed to respect Zachary's words, but now had a decision on his hands. One that weighed on him like heaviness of a completed log cabin. He dropped his head in dismay, pondering his options. Zachary took advantage of this change in position by smashing his head upward, crushing his forehead right into Abe's nose. This caused Abe to swing back and loosen his grip. Zachary was able to free his hand due to this, and managed to pull something from Abe's belt. Some sort of spike tool from the feel of it. It's a railroad spike. Zachary wasted no time trying to plunge it right into Abe's neck. Abe caught wind of this plan and adjusted his grip once more. A frustrated rage from the pain that throbbed in his nose, dripping with blood now, fueled his already more impressive stature to overpower Zachary. He managed to turn the railroad spike around towards his enemy. All he had to do was push, but in spite of his frustration, Abe just could not bring himself to do what needed to be done. Zachary, please. Forget it, Zachary responded, trying once more to turn the spike towards Abe. They struggled, both men pushing with all their might. The realization that one of their lives would end this very moment. Suddenly, the struggling stopped. Abraham looked down, and the spike had dug down straight through Zachary's chest. You just might have what it takes to win this after all, said Zachary as the life drained from his face. I'm sorry, said Abraham sorrowfully. Zachary managed to push forth a smirk before mouthing the words, "Don't be." These would be the last two words he ever managed to speak. The speaker bellowed out, "The 12th president, Zachary Taylor, has been eliminated." So this one's a little bit different because Zachary Taylor was an absolute G that took part in a lot of wars, was very good with his hands, but the reality is, in a hand-to-hand combat, Abraham Lincoln was bigger, he had wrestling experience, and there was no way that Zachary Taylor was going to beat him. He might have probably been a little bit more strategic, which is why I did all the log swinging from the tree and him trying to get a jump on him in spite of him seeing him coming. I realize now with hindsight that it probably wasn't the greatest plan ever, but look at the age he's from. They're savages. Either way, I wanted it to be the first real big fight of the story so far, and I think I did a good job. Abe sat down at Zachary's side for a moment, seeming to think over his principles for a sec. He looked at Zachary's now lifeless body. The daze was broke immediately at the sound of a bullet penetrating the dead flesh of Zachary. Abe looked up to manage to see a figure duck behind one of the trees in the distance. Immediately, Abe pulled himself to his feet and began running in the other direction. Bullets didn't seem to be flying at a consistent rate, so it would appear this is another flintlock user president. He utilized this knowledge to his advantage and focused on putting as much distance between himself and the shooter as possible, even though he didn't know the shooter's identity. After putting a bit more distance between himself and this pursuer, Abe ducked behind a tree to catch his breath. He looked around in an attempt to formulate a plan. He ducked his head out, and a bullet scraped the bark of the tree that he was hiding behind. The firing of the shot put Abe's plan into action. He spotted a hill towards the right side of the tree he was behind, and since the flintlock rifle was already hard to aim with precision, he would make it that much harder by running at an angle. He hustled quickly up the hill, pretty much sprinting at this point, where he would be able to make his own stand at the top. Surprisingly, no shots were fired during this point. This suggested that the president who was coming after him had a similar working mindset and was already savvy to Abe's plan. Abe made it to the top of the hill and spied a large oak tree, with two decent-sized boulders resting near it. He decided to make his stand behind this cover. When he got to the other side of these items, he noticed a metal manhole on the ground. Before he could investigate, he heard the sound of snapping twigs coming up the hill. In response, Abe immediately ducked behind one of the boulders and drew his pistol, as his rifle had been lost somewhere in the scuffle. He couldn't remember where, though. "Come out, Abe," screamed a deep voice. "I know you don't have a rifle." Whoever he was, he didn't have any cockiness or whimsicalness in his voice. He was all business and had a certain dryness to his voice. "I know you're an honorable man, and I'd like to give you an honorable exit. You're a smart man as well, and you know you're outgunned. Come out with your hands raised, and we can negotiate your surrender. Abe knew this would end messily, as neither one of them had any intention of surrendering. That's what Abraham was beginning to realize. Those who were willing to surrender would have already done so. That's why president after president dropped like flies in the first couple of stages of this competition. The only ones that remained were the ones who were set on winning this whole thing. If Abe knew that, then so did this man. He would likely shoot at Lincoln as soon as he stepped out of cover. The man was at the top of the hill now, seeming to circle around the cover. Abe had to confirm this, though. "How do I know you won't shoot me?" called back Abe. "Quite frankly, you don't," replied the voice. Based on its protection, he was nearing the oak tree. Abe decided to risk it. He tore from cover and pre-aimed his flintlock pistol. He had one shot. Whether he hit the target or not, it had to be a worthwhile shot in some way. He dove past the rock and the man came into view. It was William Henry Harrison. Before this could register, Abe steadied his shot mid-dive and fired. William had already aimed his rifle at this point, but the pistol shot him in the bicep. This caused William's aim to rocket upward, proving to save Abe's life. It still managed to hit Abe in the shoulder, though, causing him to writhe in pain. Abe, feeling satisfied he had disarmed the man, checked his wound. William, however, was angered by his. With one hand over his bicep, he rushed in immediately and kicked Abe in the ribs before he could fully recover. The breath was knocked from Abe as he struggled to recollect his bearings. William delivered another massive kick to the midsection as Abe struggled on his hands and knees, sending him rolling towards the other side of the hill. This side of the hill wasn't sloped, however. It was a straight drop, a cliff. They were heading towards a cliff. William was well aware of this, and his plan was clear: to dump Abe to his death. He attempted to deliver another kick, but Abe somehow managed to catch the leg and torqued it the other way with all his might, resulting in a single leg takedown. Wrestling. Shades of Abe's I didn't need to say it. Shades of Abe's wrestling experience. The two men struggled on the ground, but each change of possession ended up rolling them closer and closer to the cliff's edge. Somehow, Abe ended up with his back towards the edge, just a few feet from falling. William caught wind of this and adjusted his position to begin pushing Abe towards his demise. Abe made it back to his feet, however, adjusted his feet, and with a quick few movements grabbed a hold of William's arms. William was quite the brawler, but he lacked technique. Through the wheezing of his bruised ribs and pain in his shoulder, Abe was able to manipulate his way to William's back through various small position battles. He pulled him a bit closer to the edge, and Abe had made his peace. "I'm sorry," Abe whispered to William before pulling him in close and then launching him over the side of the cliff with a releasing German suplex. There was no screaming, just a surprise exhale from the breath of William as he was launched off the cliff. William hit a couple times, but the amount of cracking bones Abe heard on the first hit, he was dead immediately. The speaker confirmed this. The 9th president, William Henry Harrison, has been eliminated. Abe wheezed through his bruised and possibly broken ribs as he stared off the cliff. His immersion was broken when he heard a pair of snapping sticks coming up the hill. Abe immediately, in response, ran and retrieved William's rifle before sliding back behind a boulder he had perched on earlier. Although Abe no longer had his rifle, he had ammunition that would work just as well in his pockets. He immediately began refilling the flintlock rifle and finished just in time to hear two men arrive at the top of the hill. Abe once more peeked out from behind the rock and attempted to fire his weapon, but was immediately met with a rain of automatic bullets. Immediately, Abe ducked behind the rock unscathed. The rhythm of bullets stopped a second or two later, followed by some hushed speaking that Abe couldn't quite make out. Abe contemplated for a second before throwing his flintlock rifle to the ground. He sighed a deep sigh and then pulled his iconic top hat off. He reached inside the top hat and pulled out an AK-47. He swung to the other side of the rock and immediately started firing on the unknown men's positions. He appeared to hit one, but couldn't make out too much more other than hearing screams and a bit of profanity. The other one screamed back, "He's got an automatic!" Abe continued to peek out in small increments, firing on their position. He continued to do so until he heard an interesting noise, almost like a mechanized spinning of sorts. Realization hit him, and he dove back fully behind the boulder before a barrage of bullets from a minigun began tearing through the air. The other two men were screaming, betrayed by their unseen third compadre. The speakers seemed to confirm this. President number 21, Chester A. Arthur, has been eliminated. President number 31, Herbert Hoover, has been eliminated. Abe barely heard the announcement over the choir chorus of bullets raining upon his position. All he could do was hold, as he would be ripped to shreds if he dared peek out. Suddenly, the bullet beat stopped, and all that remained was the mechanized spinning. Must have to reload, but he knew he didn't have long. There was only one thing he could do. Abe sprinted towards the manhole cover, threw the lid up, and saw a ladder on the other side of the hole. A ladder descended into unfathomable darkness. He heard the spinning begin back up, and without thinking began to climb down the ladder with the cover slamming back overhead. The camera immediately shifts from one form of darkness to another as we change our view from Honest Abe to an unlikely set of partners whom are exploring a cave. Richard Nixon and JFK are making their way through the dark caverns of a cave, possibly in the island's eeriest location. Brace yourselves, you might be hearing the worst Boston accent of all time. "Are you sure there's anything down here?" asks JFK, suggesting that he's the man who was along for the ride. "No, but in my time in office, I know there's always something more than meets the eye with caves," replied Richard Nixon. JFK shook his head in confusion, failing to believe that he had actually agreed to go along with this madman's plans. Though Richard did have a point, and if nothing else, it would make for one of the better potential bunker locations on the island for holding up. The pair continued deeper and deeper into the cave, only for it to get darker and darker and darker. They had a limited amount of oil in the lanterns they had found at the beginning of the cave, so it wasn't the most ideal situation. "Perhaps we should go..." It's so bad. "Perhaps we should stop here and go back..." I can't do a Boston accent, guy. I'm just going to go back to regular. "Perhaps we should stop here and go back a little bit," said JFK. Richard ignored him and kept marching forward, merely seeming to reply with a... John couldn't hide the fact that he was worried about the realistic potential of getting trapped in a pitch-black cave with limited resources. But he knew that he and Richard had made a great team in the past. He had to keep it together. They continued forward with the impending darkness making the minutes feel thick to wade through. Just as the darkest moment, John could see a light in the distance. Richard saw it too. Neither of them needed to say anything as they were already sinking in a beeline right for the light. The closer they got, the more clear the light became. It was a question mark. There was something familiar about it as they came up upon it. It was undoubtedly something they knew. It was a long box with question marks carved all over it. Light shone through each one. John looked over at Richard, his face dimly lit by the light that radiated from the markings. He put his hand on top of the box, and it responded with a noise. A jingle of sorts. In tune with it, a light broke open from the box. Images of various weapons and guns rotated in a wheel-like fashion. "Mystery box," Richard muttered with a smug, victorious tone, as though he was reunited with an old friend. The cycling stopped and settled on an alien-esque looking gun. "No way." Turning into Christopher Walken. "I got ray gun first try." I cannot do a Boston accent. "Beans for the chowder here." "No way," John said. "I got the ray gun first try." It's a Call of Duty Zombies reference. These two were in a zombies map. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to go too detailed into it. Anyway, back to the story. This only added to the excitement for Richard as he rushed forward to get his turn. Me, he said, as he slapped the top of the box so hard that a shock of pain shot through it. His excitement acted as an anesthetic that numbed this pain, though, as anticipation to see what gun would land blocked everything else. The cycle went through its progression, then settled on a rocket launcher. The M72 Law, a weapon with explosive results, chortled Richard as he laughed at his own joke. "Yeah, but it's not ideal for close It's not ideal for close range, especially in a cave like this. We should spin it again," suggested JFK. Richard hit the top of the box again, but when the cycle ended this time, it landed on a decrepit stuffed teddy bear. A horrendous, otherworldly laugh rang out in response to this, and the box began to levitate. In a flash of light, it vanished. "Well, thank goodness we brought some rifles with us then," said John. Disappeared? After only 2 hits? Richard was irate. Almost as though in response to the disappearance of the box, a familiar chorus of angelic voices rang out through the cave, seemingly to signify the start of something. "We better go," started John, with Richard immediately nodding his head in agreement. "Hur! They continued down the cave for just a moment before noticing that they now heard multiple pairs of footsteps from other parts of the cave, not just counting their own. They continued forward, turned a corner, and then they saw it. An undead corpse walking towards them. "Just like the Pentagon, the souls of the damned have staked their claim," said Richard in a panic. With that, they took off running. The cave proved to be a cannoli of the undead, however, as every corner they seemed to turn into had more zombies pouring from whatever hole they could find out. After being surrounded from all sides, John and Richard looked at each other and had a slight silent agreement. They had to fight. John fired his newly acquired weapon, the ray gun. Richard, not so much. Instead, he pulled out a little handy SMG out of his person. John's proved to be the more reliable weapon, almost as though it was specifically made for such an occasion. With just a few well-placed shots from the ray gun and a bit of cleanup from Richard's spray, they were able to make a push out of their undead cage. The further they went down this new path, the less cave-like it seemed, though. Eventually, the cold stone that their footsteps echoed off of were replaced with robotic clanks. They were walking on metal flooring. They couldn't slow down just because they had found some form of society, though, as there was an ocean of metal clanks starting to form behind them as well. It was only a matter of time before they were cornered again and they needed to break up the chase. Although the floor was metal, the ceilings looked as though it was stony, like a cave. This began to give John an idea, but before he could relay this plan to Richard, they spied a giant metal door at the end of the path. They charged forward. They attempted to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Desperation began to seep in as they pulled and tried all sorts of door opening techniques that they had mastered between the two of them. But there was no use. All the while, the oceans of metal clanks inched closer and closer. Though Richard began to panic, John instead chose this time to analyze, and his plan had to go forth. Albeit a bit prematurely, but it's going forth nonetheless. "Richard," John said, getting Richard's attention immediately. "Fire your rocket at the ceiling a few yards down the path." Richard looked down the path, then at John, then back down the path, back at John. "It'll cause a cave-in. We'll die." "There's a chance we won't," said John. "And if you don't, we'll die anyway." Richard gripped his rocket, but he didn't aim. He wasn't convinced yet. John decided to enforce some positivity into the situation. "And if we do die, at least it'll be quick." Richard looked around nervously. "Do it, Richard." Richard didn't move. The metal clanks were getting closer and closer. "Do it, Richard!" With that, Richard went, "Rah!" let out a scream, and aimed a few yards down the path and fired a rocket, just as the swarm of the undead came into view. The rocket caused a chain reaction almost immediately, with giant rocks and boulders crushing the undead. The cave-in stopped about 2 feet in front of Richard and John, though they still felt rumbling. They looked at each other and let out a couple of laughs, almost in a "holy cow, we're still alive" kind of way. They heard screeching of metal as though it was being dragged across the ground, but before they could react, Richard and John felt knocks on the back of their head. The last thing they saw before succumbing to the darkness was a pair of nicely polished shoes and a pair of hands reaching down for them. This moment here signifies a pass of time because we are going to pick back up with them when they wake up. However, I will state a couple of the rules now. I was going to state them later, but one, they've passed out for a undisclosed amount of time, probably like an hour or two, but also during this time, no one was eliminated. I think I have the characters point that out, but just in case, I do want to clarify that way there's not like any, well, what about this guy? What about this guy? All will come forward as it needed. Yes, let's go. John felt a pounding at the back of his head. He reached to put a hand over it, but found that he couldn't because his hands were restrained. He fought through the blackness of his vision and opened his eyes. There was too much light for him to still be in a cave. They must have been taken somewhere else. His vision began to settle. He could tell they were in a lab-like setting. With how metallic everything was, and a few pieces of the ceiling still resembling the stone of the cave, he was beginning to piece together that they may have found their way behind the metal door after all. Looking around the room, there were monitors, seeming to show various parts of the island. It was an observation room of sorts. The room itself appeared to be a smaller piece to an even bigger puzzle, meaning there were a bunch of rooms connected that weren't open so they couldn't see inside of them. John looked over and saw Richard, blinking his eyes pretty rapidly. It seemed like he was coming to as well. His arms appeared to be tied to his sides with some sort of unique knot. John looked down. He was tied in the exact same manner. John took this time to look even further around the room, this time in a little bit more of a closer proximity. He and Richard weren't the only ones who seemed to fall victim to whatever this was. They were set in a fairly large circle surrounding a podium-looking stage. There were other contestants of this competition sat in the circle as well. Donald Trump, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, and George Washington all joined them in this circle as well. Right as John was beginning to finally wonder who brought them all here, a voice broke through the loud silence. "Daddy, they're awake!" George Bush Jr. came skipping around the corner in excitement, like a kid on Christmas, and George Bush Sr. came out stoically walking behind him. "Don't get near them, George." "But, Daddy, I tied a really tight knot, Daddy." "Just like the Boy Scouts do." "Yes, but we don't want to leave any room for error, right, Bill?" Almost on cue, Bill Clinton came walking out with a martini glass in hand from the other side of the room. His face was flushed as it became apparent the martini in his hand wasn't his first drink. "Absolutely, George, baby." These voices are going to be the death of me, man. All three men made their way to the podium in the center. Getting a better look at it now, there was a keyboard and panel full of buttons attached to a small couple of monitors. Bill turned to address his guests. I suppose you're all wondering why you're here, and, well, not dead," said Bill. "That's because—" He was interrupted by an eager Bush Jr. "You made it to our secret base." He was hushed by his dad as he received a slightly disgusted look from Bill, who continued. "You showed decent skills by making it to this underground bunker. Because of this, we decided that we would give you the choice to surrender. But not before a reward." "Fireworks! Fireworks!" said George Bush, jumping up and down excitedly, with his dad once again having to calm him down. "Wait. Hold on a second," started Abraham Lincoln. "So what exactly is this place?" "Great question," started Bush Sr. "As already been alluded to, this is an underground bunker. It was built by the makers of the contest in case a close-up monitoring was needed for legal reasons." "Daddy's friend let us borrow his secret hideout," declared Bush Jr., who was once again hushed by his father. "So you guys had help?" asked George Washington. The camera zooms in on Donald Trump's face. "It was an inside job," he declares. "Jet fuel does melt steel beams," screamed George Bush at Trump, sticking his tongue out at him in self-defense. He was seemingly triggered by this statement. "I did have a little help, but that's what a president does," declared George Bush Sr. "He builds relationships and uses them." Bill Clinton giggled and mimicked some pelvic thrusts towards this statement. Bush Sr. rolled his eyes and continued. "If we were able to bring whatever we could to this island, then surely we could also use what was already on this island. What I brought wasn't a grenade, it wasn't a rifle, it was the hookup and information I received from an informant who happened to make the island." "We've all been there," said Bill Clinton. "Speaking of weapons, though, did you guys know that this island has a failsafe?" asked George Sr. "With one press of a button, anyone outside of this bunker would be turned to dust." "Like Fallout 4!" shouted Bush Jr. All of the tied-up presidents seemed to ponder for a moment. The silence was broken by Honest Abe. "Have you no honor? Cheating and hiding? What kind of leadership does that demonstrate?" "The kind that is still alive," snorted Bill in a manner that insinuated Abe's question was idiotic. Abe looked at the other tied-up presidents, with a look that beckoned them to help back him up on this. "You won't even give them a fighting chance?" asked George Washington, seemingly insulted. "They've had as much time to get here to this bunker as you did. You made it, so why couldn't they?" replied Bush Sr. "So you'll win by doing nothing?" asked Ulysses. "Where's the satisfaction in that?" in knowing that we can conflict solve with as few casualties as possible on our part, replied Bush Sr. I, for one, am actually okay with this, said Donald Trump. Richard Nixon went in agreement. They were running out of arguments, and worse, George Bush Sr. was making some really good sense. JFK grimaced as he looked for an argument of reason, but knew regardless of how pretty the words he spoke were, they would never paint a picture that would inspire these men to make the well-honored decision. Well, if all of us are finished chatting, said Bill, sipping on his martini. George Sr. seemed to nod at George Jr. in his response. Bush Jr. spread his arms out like a plane and vroom, vroom, vroom over to the control box. He lifted a glass cover that covered a giant red button. Before any more words of protest could break forth, he smashed his hand down upon it hard. Everyone waited. No noise immediately happened. The silence felt like an eternity, and seconds ticked by as though they were hours. The earth and bunker remained still. "Well, what a load of crap that was," barked Richard Nixon in amusement. As if on cue to diffuse this statement, the ground shook violently. The sounds of explosion outside miles of earth could be heard as terrain was chewed up by a fiery explosion. JFK could faintly see bombs dropping on the monitors across the room as pieces of the island began to look more like craters. One by one, the monitors themselves seemed to black out as the cameras were destroyed. Immediately, the announcements began to rain in. The third president, Thomas Jefferson, has been eliminated. The fifth president, James Monroe, has been eliminated. The sixth president, John Quincy Adams, has been eliminated. Everyone in the observation room stood or sat speechless, regardless of their opposition. The tied-up men, obviously, because they were witnessing destruction, but the three conspirators, however, seemed to be more impressed and in awe. The 11th president, James K. Polk, has been eliminated. The 13th president, Millard Fillmore, has been eliminated. President number 17, Andrew Johnson, has been eliminated. Daddy, I'm going to be the kill leader, said Bush Jr. as he hopped up and down in amusement. Bush Sr. smiled and proudly gave him a high five. President number 20, James A. Garfield, has been eliminated. President number 33, Harry S. Truman, has been eliminated. President number 34, Dwight D. Eisenhower, has been eliminated, the voice continued. JFK seemed to be counting off numbers in his head. It's possible presidents could have been eliminated at a number of moments where he wasn't paying attention, but there's a few names he noticed hadn't been called out during his moments of consciousness, whether earlier or at this very moment. President number 36, Lyndon B. Johnson, has been eliminated. President number 40, Ronald Reagan, has been eliminated. As that last name was read off, there seemed to be anticipation as everyone listened to hear more. It seems like the parade of names had finally come to an end for now. "More names, Daddy," said Bush Jr. angrily as he plugged up his ears and stomped his feet. In time, George, in time. For now, we have a generous offer for our guests," said Bill as he walked down the podium and right up to Donald Trump. "We're going to go around in the circle," he continued, "and give each of you an opportunity for a civilized surrender." Abe seemed to scoff at the word civilized, but Bill ignored it with his words. His gaze, however, told a different story. Still standing by Donald, his eyes pierced right by Abe like a well-placed arrow. He kept the stare throughout this next line. "If you refuse," Bill pulled out a gun and turned the safety off with a click. "Then I'm gonna blow your brains out. You can call me Lewinsky, 'cause I'm good at blowing, just in a different way." Bill chuckled at his last joke, his gaze fixed back on Donald. "What do you say, Donald? Shall we keep it civilized? You're a businessman. How can you win a deal if you lose your life?" Donald didn't even seem to think about it for a second longer. "You're right. I surrender." With that, the speaker announced, "The 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, has been eliminated," declared the speakers. Bill proceeded to cut Donald Trump loose and pointed to the pod at the end of the room so he could exit. Bill made his way to the next man in the rotation, George Washington. He gave him the same choice, surrender or die. Before Washington could answer, though, JFK finally decided to speak up. "You know," here come the Christopher Walken impressions, apparently. "You know, I think there are some unaccounted contestants still in the game." "Nuh-uh," said George Jr. "Impossible," declared George Sr. JFK continued, "While Richard and I were out, did any names come over the intercom?" I'm just going full Christopher Walken at this point. The three conspirators thought for a second. Finally, George Sr. answered, "No, I actually don't believe so." "Then there's at least a couple whose names I haven't heard." "There's no way you can remember every name that's been called," declared Bush Jr. matter-of-factly while playing with a Hot Wheel that he pulled from his coat pocket. "That's like a lot of names." "Maybe look at the monitors," suggested JFK. Everyone's gaze is turned towards the array of monitors on the wall. Half of the cameras, as said earlier, are now dark, seemingly destroyed because of the bombs. The other half were full of static, and a few ones remained properly working, but didn't seem to show any signs of life running across them. Bill Clinton merely threw his hands toward the monitors in a gesture that was like, "See, we can't." "Do you guys have any way we could figure out how many people are left?" "Of course we do," barked George Jr., dropping his Hot Wheel on the floor abruptly. "We're not stupid." He then proceeded to demonstrate. "Computer, how many contestants are..." I'm changing my George Bush voice, because I really want him to be a little kid, but George Bush has the tacos. "Computer, how many contestants are left?" "There are currently 12 contestants remaining in the competition," declared the speakers. At this, George Sr. and Bill Clinton got confused looks on their faces as the math didn't add up. George Jr. started counting the members of the room using his fingers. As if on cue, a tied-up Woodrow Wilson came barreling out of a large vent in the ceiling, right in between Bill Clinton and JFK. His mouth was taped as well, so all that came forth was a muffled panic. As Bill approached him, Woodrow seemed to attempt to roll away. He ended up right at the feet of JFK, however. Bill came forward and leaned down at his side. "What's going on?" he said, immediately tugging at the tape from Woodrow's mouth. Woodrow fought and tried to figure out the words, but all that came out was, "Grenade!" Immediately, an explosion erupted from Woodrow's person, killing him instantly and sending Bill, who was in the duration of the blast, flying across the room. Bill's head smacked on the vent at an angle, breaking his neck. JFK was flung back by the explosion at his feet, smacking him into a wall about 15 feet behind him, shrapnel penetrating him before that time even came. The 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, has been eliminated. The 35th president, John F. Kennedy, has been eliminated. The 42nd president, Bill Clinton, has been eliminated. Pause for a second. This is terrible, and like I said, this should not be taken serious. This is not my opinions or anything of these presidents, but it took everything inside of me not to do a magic bullet joke, but I decided to be an impactful way. This would be a shock way to eliminate one of the main villains at the point in this story, eliminate somebody who was just kept alive for this purpose, and eliminate one of our quote-unquote main characters. I thought it was a nice little... Either way. At this transpiring of events, George Bush Sr. stood motionless with a facial reading that suggested he was now beyond belief. George Bush Jr. began crying. Bush Sr. snapped out of it and then walked over to the control panel. He began adjusting some settings, but then heard a vent creak. He looked up just in time to see Andrew Jackson drop down right on top of him. Like something out of Assassin's Creed, Jackson dropped on top of him, pulled out a knife, and stabbed him in the jugular as they fell to the ground, all in one fluid motion. "Hush now, sweet prince," said Andrew Jackson as Bush Sr. choked on his own blood. By this point, everyone who still remained tied to the chairs were recovering from the shockwave of the grenade and were attempting to get themselves free, fighting against the restraints. "The 41st president, George Bush Sr., has been eliminated," droned the speakers. With that, Andrew Jackson wiped his blade off with a pocket handkerchief and turned mechanically towards the scattered circle. "Get us out of here, Andrew," Ulysses Grant said, his words not even seeming to register with Andrew. Abraham Lincoln sighed. "He's not going to free us. He'll devour us like the fish that were unlucky enough to end up in his barrel." With unexpected speed, Andrew Jackson sprinted over to George Washington, still upright in his chair. Mid-sprint, he jumped up and tackled George and his chair to the ground. Getting into a better position, he then grabbed his knife once more and stabbed George once. He stabbed him twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. He just kept stabbing and stabbing as everyone looked onward in horror. "Shh, it'll be over soon," Then I'll take out that third George over there, said Andrew, eyeing a crying George Jr. over under the table. Bush Jr. winced as their eyes met. George Washington gurgled in response as though he was trying to talk to him. "What's that?" questioned Andrew as he lowered his ear down towards George. George opened his mouth to reveal the nastiest horror movie dentures you'll ever see, and with his final few moments of life, bit into the ear and bit into the face of Andrew Jackson, who screamed out in pain. Andrew pushed George's head down, with the force tearing a chunk of flesh from his own cheek. He plunged his knife completely into George's skull in response. "The first president, George Washington, has been eliminated," declared the speakers. Andrew cradled his face in his arms for a moment. He then composed himself by humming a patriotic song, whispering, "For your country, Jackson," in a military general-esque voice, and then walking back over to Washington. He put his foot on George's head and used the leverage to pull the blade out. After wiping blood and some brain matter off with his handkerchief, he used the knife as a mirror to look at his face. Seeing his split ear and hamburger meat cheek sent him into a rage. He kicked George Washington's corpse over and over again in frustration. Finally, Abraham Lincoln broke. "He's already dead! Don't dishonor yourself even more, Andrew." Andrew's head snapped upward. The message was received loud and clear. He turned around robotically and pointed his knife at Abe. "George number 3 can wait. Now for my next meal." He started walking towards Abe's chair. "I'm thinking I want to try some Abraham." As he finished his quip, he turned into a sprint. It was only a matter of time now. Closer and closer he got when finally he lunged into the air. A gunshot ripped through the intensity like a butter knife. Andrew's body landed on top of Abe, which sent him backwards in the chair. Everyone's head turned towards the direction of the gunshot. It was Donald Trump, who had returned to the area that he was taken to by Bill after being eliminated. He calmly walked over and kicked Andrew in the side of the ribs. Andrew gasped and flipped off of the top of Abe onto his back. Donald, without a second to think about it, shot him in the head to confirm the kill. "The 7th president, Andrew Jackson, has been eliminated," said the speakers. Wait a second. You're eliminated. The security measures will target your biometrics if you stay too long," declared Richard Nixon. "Why are you back?" "You see, I can't do his accent. I was testing out a theory," declared Donald. "You see, I've been president at 2 different slots in the order. When I was eliminated, it sounded like they only announced one of them. Technically, I'm still in the competition. There was only one other president who could make that claim, and both of his numbers were called out, which I imagine means he's dead." "So you work the system?" asked a disappointed Abraham Lincoln. Donald merely smiled and said, "You're welcome." "So what's next?" asked Ulysses. "How is this all going to end?" Before Donald could answer, he was sent flying with a huge ray of light. Everyone turned to see Bush Jr. holding the ray gun that he had confiscated from JFK. He fired it a second time, which was met by a response from the speakers. "The 47th president, Donald Trump, has been eliminated." "Come back from that," said Bush. "That quip was actually kind of clever. You sounded smart for a second," said Richard. "Me is smart," replied George angrily as he pointed the ray gun towards Richard. "Calm down, George," said Abraham. "Everything's going to be okay." "No, it's not," replied George. "This is not how Daddy's plan was supposed to go." He sounded as though he was going to start crying again. "Plans change. We can still come out of this in a safe manner, young man," said Abe. "No," George said, getting super serious. "Just me." He pointed the ray gun at Abe, put his finger on the trigger when he was interrupted by the sound of tearing metal. It was coming from behind George as he turned around to see one of the bunker door entrances getting physically torn from its hinges. A couple of grizzly bears came pouring into the room, and riding on the back of the second one was none other than Theodore Roosevelt. They rode over to free the captives, while the first grizzly bear marched towards George to secure the target. George ran away and fired the ray gun over and over again. It actually seemed to suppress the bigger bear. The first captive freed was Richard Nixon, who immediately went in search of a weapon. With a few more shots from the ray gun, Bush managed to kill his first attacking grizzly. With a sigh of relief, he turned his attention to the other one. He began immediately firing before the grizzly bear even looked at him. The second captive freed was easily the most injured, Abraham Lincoln. On top of the injuries he had just suffered on his solo expedition, including broken ribs, hole in his shoulder, a hole in his hand, he was now hurt by the shockwave from the Woodrow Wilson grenade, had a bit of shrapnel in his leg, and had his head bounce off the pavement when Jackson landed on him. Before long, Bush had finished killing the second bear and was now turning his attention to Teddy Roosevelt, who was currently untying Ulysses. "The game is over," said Bush in a pouty manner. "Agreed," said Richard Nixon from the podium. Bush turned around to see Richard Nixon fully aiming his rocket launcher right at him. Before Bush could even say a word of protest or point his gun, the trigger was pulled and a rocket hit him head on. He was instantly turned into a pile of baloney. "The 43rd President, George Bush, has been eliminated," declared the speaker. Teddy Roosevelt finished untying Ulysses as our final four competitors came together. Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Ulysses Grant, and Richard Nixon. They all seemed to nod in understanding as they put a bit of distance in between each other, but they all noticed it too. Abe struggled to move. He could barely stand. His walk soon turned into a crawl, and his leg and head injuries made him immobile. They seemed to all make a noise in disgust as they realized what this battle had done to a very honorable man. "You got this, Abe," said Ulysses, encouraging him. "Yeah, let's get it, Abe," said Teddy half-heartedly as he became more worried about his condition and his friend. Teddy versus Abe. That was the battle everyone had been waiting for. Now Teddy finally had his wish to fight the best of the best. It was an easy victory for the taking. Yet here lay a broken man who gave everything. Teddy couldn't bear it. "I surrender," said Teddy. "This competition is yours, Abe. You deserve it." "The 26th President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, has been eliminated," echoed the speaker. "Teddy, no," said Abe, disappointed, but also half out of it from his injuries. Ulysses seemed to nod in agreement. "He's right, Abe. I surrender too. There are greater victories to be had as a man than simply winning this battle." "The 18th President, Ulysses S. Grant, has been eliminated." Abe smiled. That meant a lot coming from the no-surrender attitude like Ulysses. "I guess there's a lot we've learned here today, gentlemen," said Abe. "There are greater things to be won in life than proving our machismo and winning battles. Sometimes in war, there are no winners, but I think today we all found that we all have a way to win." "I surrender," said Abe. "There are more important things than this battle, and I think we all win realizing that." "The 16th President, Abraham Lincoln, has been eliminated." No," said Richard Nixon. "That's not true. I win. I win. I win," said Richard Nixon as he makes a ton of noise. "The 37th President, Richard Nixon, has achieved the victory royale. He wins," declared the speakers. Abe, Ulysses, and Teddy laugh as Richard celebrates his victory. Much to their initial disappointment, Richard's actions against George did kind of save the day. This is a result we can all be satisfied in, right? Right? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my version of the Presidential Battle Royale. And I kind of wrote it in a way in which there are many different ways we can do this. Maybe this will be a tradition every 4th of July. I don't know. But I think it was a satisfying ending. It was very action-packed, last 10 pages. I had a lot of fun characters, and I want to create more next time. I think I want to do a little bit more research going into next year. But let me know what you think about it. I know that it's almost like an anti-war message at the end, and I didn't want it to come off that way. I wanted Richard's victory to kind of be like, yeah, screw that. But I don't know. I'm satisfied with the ending. I don't know if everybody's going to be, because they wanted like a big wrestling match between Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. But for this iteration of the story and the story I wanted to tell, I think I can live with it. But we shall see. Maybe next year I'll tell the entire story from one man's perspective or something like that. But I really enjoyed writing this, and I want to know your thoughts. Hopefully it was entertaining, if nothing else, and you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know. And so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The wacky, whimsical, crazy Battle Royale was finished, and hopefully it was worth it. And I have already plugged to death all of my social medias. We just got a Facebook page, which you guys are already making the most active social media I have. But anywhere you can contact me is in the show notes. It's in the description, whatever you call it on your social media platform. I would appreciate it if you would contact me and let me know what you think about this episode. But even if you've just made it to this point, that means the world to me. And normally I do this little plugging at the end, but I'm actually going to end on the positive note, say goodbye, and then we're going to part ways and hopefully see each other again next week. Mainly because the book that I've been reading from is Discipline Equals Freedom, the Jocko Willink Field Manual. And this week's chapter hit me very hard because it actually kind of coincides with, I'll just read it. Focus. In combat, focus comes pretty easily because the battle is right in front of your face. You have no choice but to focus. But sometimes in day-to-day life, you can lose track of the long-term goal. It fades from your vision. It slips from your mind. Wrong. I want that long-term goal to be so embedded in my mind that I never lose sight of it. Ever. And the little tasks and projects and short-term goals that you tackle need to lead toward strategic victory, winning that long war. But we want results now. We want the shortcut to the winner's podium. We need the instant gratification, and when we don't get the short-term glory, sometimes we lose sight of these long-term goals. They fade. We lose focus, so we stop the daily tasks and the daily disciplines that allow us to achieve our goals. And a day slips by, and then another day. And a day turns into a week, and a week into a year, and you look up in 6 weeks, or 6 months, or 6 years, and you've made no progress. None. You never moved. In fact, you might even be further from your goal than you were when you started. You might have gone backward. Why? Why did you let that happen? Because you lost sight of it. You lost sight of the long-term goal, and it faded. It faded from memory, and the passion dried up, and you began to rationalize. Maybe I can't. Maybe I don't really want to. Maybe this goal isn't for me. And so you give up. You let it go, and you settle. You settle for the status quo. You settle for the easy road. You settle for the, oh well. No. Don't do that. Embed that long-term goal in your mind. Burn it into your very being. Think about it. Write about it. Talk about it. Hang it on your wall. But most important, do something about it. Every day. Every single day. Do something that moves you toward that goal. That keeps that goal alive and in sight and in focus. However small or insignificant that step might seem, take it. Do it. Make it happen because that goal isn't going to achieve itself. It is all on you. And that's real because, I talk a lot about the Zan Man podcast, the podcast I used to have. And sometimes it feels like I'm focusing more on that than more on this podcast, but I'm just trying to learn from the lessons of why the previous podcast failed. And this right here is one of those big lessons because towards the end there, I rationalized not recording the episode now. I rationalized, maybe I don't need to upload this week. And then, if the next episode's going to be really, really good. So if I didn't upload this month, then that's going to be okay because the next episode's going to be really, really good. And I'm ignoring the consistency. I'm ignoring this. I'm ignoring this and that and this and that. And the reality is I'm making no progress because I'm not uploading. I'm not being consistent. I'm losing subscribers because I'm not taking action. If you refuse to take all of the little steps, you don't realize in that moment that all those little steps add up to something huge. It's that quote of, if you improve by 1% every single day for a year, then by the end of the year, you have improved by 365%. And as much as I just sounded like I was mocking it in that tone, it's real. Improvement, no matter how small or significant, adds up very quickly. And that's what I'm trying to realize with this podcast. Even now, with how long I've been putting off this podcast, I still feel like every single day I've been contributing it. Every single day I've started writing part of the story that I just read. Whether it sucks or not is irrelevant. I've been contributing to it, and it's led to this episode. Even if I wasn't uploading every week, I was still doing something about it. And maybe that's a justification for myself. Maybe I fell short of some things, but I can learn from those things. I can learn that if I'm going to write a story, don't plan it the week before you have to upload the episode. Plan these in advance. Because even though I did a podcast for 3 years, I'm still learning. Obviously, I can still grow. And as humans, we're going to fall short sometimes. But it's important to keep those goals in mind. It's important to keep moving and not realize that you've been standing in place for years. And that hit me really hard because while I was recording this episode and editing it, I looked at the clock and I was like, man, I'm just going to go to bed and work at this episode after work tomorrow. And that's a very real thing because tomorrow probably would have turned into another day and then another day and then another day. And I don't know what I'm kind of telling somebody from this. I just know I have a real problem with this. I have a real problem with having so many ideas, but procrastinating on putting the action behind it. And the reality is I've been standing in place and it's time to start moving forward. So I want to invite someone out there who might be listening to this podcast. And if you've made it to this point, thank you so much. But allow me to give back to you and say, move forward, take those steps, work towards that goal, and accomplish something. I know you can do it, and I don't really believe in myself all that often, but I know I can do it as well. And we're going to achieve our goals if we put that work in, but that work has to start somewhere. Why not now? And that's real. So thank you guys so much for watching. Those are just the random thoughts I've had for this week. Hopefully you'll come by to see what else you could pick from my brain. But that's a little bit too much Zandman thoughts for this week. The longest episode in this podcast history. Even though we're only 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Nah, we're only a couple episodes in. But maybe one day we'll be looking back and we'll be like, it's episode 100. And I'll reach that milestone in a different way by producing these high quality episodes for you, and hopefully you guys will be enjoying it every step of the way. So thank you so much, and I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye guys.